Hi, my name's Evan Williams. I'm continuing on with Chapter 1, the new book that I'm writing. It's Thursday, February 5th, 2009, and the title of this chapter is The Way of the Chestnut. It all made a deep impression on Glenn, so much so that 50 years later he would tell his grandson about the best beef he ever ate. Never tasted anything like it since. The fat wasn't white like all of it is nowadays. No, sir, it was yellow, all nice and yellow, and it gave the meat a flavor like nothing else. You know what gave the fat that yellow color? At which point I would shake my head to indicate that I had no idea, no matter how many times I had heard this story, and on he would go. Of course, you'll never see that again, because that meat came from cattle that fed on chestnuts. It was the chestnuts that made the fat yellow. Then he would pause with a faraway look that deeply grieved me for his sake, at which point the story would take an abrupt turn from succulent steaks to chestnut trees. Castanea dentata, the American chestnut, was the object of Paul Glenn's admiration. He was not alone, for many considered this magnificent tree to be the king of the southeastern U.S. forests. When he spoke of it in unbridled reverence, it was as if he could not say enough good about this species that played a major role in his early life. You never saw such a tree. Standing 100 feet high was not uncommon, and 10 feet through. Well, just the other day, I saw an old photograph of one with some folks gathered around its base, 20 feet across. And this article said that some fellers estimated that back in my day, 1 out of every 4 trees was a chestnut. I believe it. They was everywhere. He would look a little sadder when he realized that he was speaking in the past tense, but that didn't quell his enthusiasm. They used to grow all around my daddy's pasture, and the nuts would fall in the grass where the cattle was grazing. Of course, they was inside that spiny overcoat that protected them. Looked kind of like a porcupine. Now, when I was a boy, having run barefoot all summer, I could open that spiny husk with my feet. Anyway, those cattle would feed on those chestnuts until it turned their fat yellow and gave the meat that one-of-a-kind flavor. Deer fed on them too. Those was American chestnuts, not like those Chinese ones they've got around here now. No comparison. Bigger and sweeter, he said they were, craved by bovine and human alike. So Glenn and his daddy, like any enterprising mountain folk, turned their good fortune from nature into a cash crop. Gathering up all the empty canning jars they could find, they filled enough of them with chestnuts to make 2 wagon loads. Early the next morning, they hitched horses to the wagons and began the long, slow journey to Spartanburg. The steep, narrow descent was more a trail than a road, as it snaked its way down the mountain to the distant flatlands below. No way to hurry along. This would amount to an all-day trip, with them arriving around nightfall at the farmer's market, which was little more than a field near town. Area growers met there to sell their wares. Worn out from being tossed about in the hard wooden seat, Glenn and his daddy would eat a bit, then sleep for the night under the wagons. The next morning, we'd have all those chestnuts sold for 10 o'clock. See, they didn't have them down there. Chestnuts wouldn't grow in the flatlands, so we'd sell out in a hurry and head back up the mountain with cash money, whatever was left after we bought some supplies. How many times would I hear that phrase, cash money? Not just from Pa Glenn, but from most of my Depression-era relatives whose families seldom had currency. Mostly they bartered for what they needed, grew it themselves, or simply did without. For many in the mountains saw precious little cash money, and those that had it were legendary. Remember Lee Staton? One of my great aunts would say. Dad used to go borrow money from him and Lee never asked what it was for. He knew Dad would pay it back. Of course, Lee also bought up cheap land where he could, put together a nice big farm that way. So when Pa Glenn and his dad could head back up Sugarloaf Mountain with cash money in hand, it was a big deal, and I showed due respect at this point in the story. Then he would continue on, extolling the merits of the American chestnut. Straight-grained wood that was as easy to work as poplar. But don't let that fool you. It was strong as oak, but light as white pine. Purty, too, and resisted rot as good or better than locust. We used it for bridges, split rail fences, ox yokes, wall logs, joists and rafters, furniture, gun stocks, kitchen items, most everything. My daddy and uncles even sold the bark, which was used for leather tanning. Some of those tanneries would set up shop around here to be close to the source. So you see, there's never been a more all-purpose wood afore or since. Of course, that was before the blight got 'em. You can still see some of the old fallen logs when you drive along the Blue Ridge Parkway, and new trees will spring up from the old roots. Then he would look down at the ground and shake his head. But they never got old enough to bear nuts before they end up catching the blight. The personal and broader tragedy were obvious. Glenn's life and the lives of a huge segment of this country were about to change after the chestnut blight made its first appearance at the Bronx Zoo in New York in 1904. It would rapidly radiate throughout the continent, so that by 1940, the once mighty chestnut was no more. Now, most of those who enjoyed its blessings have also gone the way of the chestnut. Yes, sir, that was the best tasting meat I ever ate.